You're seated in 14C, wedged between the window and a stranger who's already asleep with his mouth open. When the gate agent's voice crackles through the cabin, speaker asking for a volunteer to give up their seat, nobody moves. And that's when you notice him, the old man in 22A, already unbuckling his seatbelt before anyone else even processes what's happening. His name, you'll learn in a few minutes, is Amos Whitfield. He's 83 years old, wearing a faded Army veteran's cap and a cardigan with a small pin on the collar that you can't quite make out from where you're sitting. He stands slowly, using the seat back in front of him for support, and begins gathering his small carry-on without being asked twice. Nobody offered. He just assumed it should be him. The flight attendant, a young woman with a tight smile and an even tighter schedule, approaches him with visible relief. "Sir, we appreciate you being so understanding. We're overbooked and need one more seat for a family that got separated." She doesn't ask if he minds. She doesn't ask why he's the one standing. She just accepts it, like his willingness confirms. He was always meant to be the one who gives something up. You watch this happen and something in your chest tightens, because you recognize what's happening here even before anyone says it out loud. An old man alone, unaccompanied, is being quietly moved out of his seat while a bus of people with families and connections and complaints stays comfortably seated. If you've ever watched someone quietly sacrifice for others without anyone noticing or saying thank you, stay with me for this one. And if it means something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what happens next on this plane isn't something you'll forget. And I promise you, by the end, you won't be able to look at strangers on a plane the same way again. Amos moves down the aisle with his small bag, and you realize he's not being reseated. In the cabin, the flight attendant is walking him toward economy's rearmost row, the middle seat between two teenagers who don't even look up from their phones. He settles in without complaint. No sigh, no visible frustration, just the quiet compliance of a man who has spent a lifetime making himself smaller so other people could have more room. You'd learn later, piece by piece, that Amos Whitfield had flown this same route 11 times in the last 2 years, not for vacation, not for business, but to see his daughter, Winifred, who lives 3 states away and is going through chemotherapy. Each trip cost him nearly everything he has left on his fixed veteran's pension. And each trip he sits alone, speaks to no one, and quietly endures whatever inconvenience the day throws at him, because complaining has never once occurred to him as an option. The flight takes off, and for the first 40 minutes, nothing remarkable happens. You order a ginger ale. The man beside you continues to snore. Outside your window, the clouds stretch endlessly beneath the wing, indifferent to everything happening. 30,000 feet below them and 30,000 feet within this pressurized metal tube. But then, somewhere over what you assume is Kansas, a commotion starts 3 rows back. Not loud, not dramatic, just a rising murmur of confused voices. You crane your neck and see a young flight attendant crouched in the aisle, near the back of the plane, speaking urgently into her radio. "We need a doctor," she says, her professional calm cracking slightly at the edges. "Is there a doctor on board?" Your stomach drops. You don't need to ask who it's about. Somehow you already know. A man near the front stands up, younger, maybe 40, wearing a wrinkled button-down like he'd been called away from something important. He introduces himself as Dr. Cyrus Bellamy and moves quickly toward the back of the plane, threading through the narrow aisle with practiced urgency. You unbuckle your seatbelt without fully deciding to and follow a few steps behind, some instinct pulling you toward the scene even though you have no medical training and nothing useful to offer. When you reach the back row, you see Amos Whitfield slumped slightly against the teenager beside him, his breathing shallow and uneven, his skin pale in a way that makes your own chest tighten with fear. The teenagers, to their credit, have finally looked up from their phones, one of them holding Amos's veteran's cap like he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. "Sir, can you hear me?" Dr. Bellamy asks, already checking Amos's pulse, his voice steady and clinical, despite the tension radiating through the cramped space. "What's your name?" "Amos," the old man manages, his voice thin as paper. "Amos Whitfield." "Amos, I need you to stay with me. Do you have any heart conditions? Any medications?" Amos's hand trembles as he reaches into his cardigan pocket, and Dr. Bellamy gently helps him retrieve a small orange prescription bottle. The label is worn from years of handling, and even from where you're standing, you can see it's nearly empty. refilled far less often than it should have been. "When's the last time you took this?" Dr. Bellamy asks, and something in Amos's hesitation tells you everything you need to know before he even answers. "Been stretching them out," Amos admits quietly, shame flickering across his weathered face. "Can't always afford the refill on time. The cabin has gone eerily quiet around you. Passengers who moments ago were absorbed in movies and magazines are now leaning into the aisle, watching, listening, understanding in real time that the quiet, old man who gave up his seat without complaint has been silently rationing his heart. Medication because of full price, flight to see his sick daughter left nothing over for anything else." Dr. Bellamy works fast, calling for the plane's emergency medical kit, checking Amos's blood, pressure with hands that don't shake even though the whole plane seems to be holding its breath. The flight attendant relays information to the cockpit. Somewhere up front, the captain is already coordinating with air traffic control about a possible emergency landing. And then something happens that you'll remember for the rest of your life. Something that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the quiet decency that occasionally surfaces in the most unexpected of places. A woman 2 rows up, elegant, maybe 60, wearing a scarf that suggests she'd rather be anywhere, but on a red-eye flight, unbuckles her seatbelt and walks back to where Amos is being treated. Her name, you'll learn, is Ottilie Fairweather, and she doesn't say anything dramatic. She simply kneels down beside the row, takes Amos's trembling hand in both of hers, and says, "You're not alone right now. I've got you." It's such a small thing, and yet it seems to break something open in the cabin. A young mother, a few rows back, offers her son's inhaler, thinking it might somehow help, not fully understanding medicine but desperate to contribute something. An older man across the aisle, a stranger to everyone, including Amos, quietly starts praying under his breath, his lips moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who has done this before for people he loved. The teenagers who'd been sitting beside Amos, the ones glued to their phones 20 minutes earlier, are now both crying quietly, holding onto his cap like it's something precious that needs protecting. Dr. Bellamy manages to stabilize Amos enough that the emergency landing, while still necessary, no longer feels like a race against the clock. The captain announces they'll be diverting to the nearest airport, and rather than the groans of frustration you might expect from delayed passengers, the cabin responds with something closer to relief, even gratitude, as if everyone on this plane has suddenly remembered what actually matters when circumstances strip away the illusion of urgency around connecting flights and dinner reservations. As the plane begins its descent, Ottilie stays kneeling beside Amos, still holding his hand, and it's during this quiet stretch of waiting that Amos, breathing steadier now, begins to talk, not much, just fragments, about his daughter Winifred, about the chemotherapy she's fighting through 3 states away, about how he sold his truck 2 years ago to help cover a portion of her medical bills he wasn't supposed to know about but found out anyway, about how flying coach in the very back of the plane has never once felt like a sacrifice to him because it means he gets to see her face at all. "She doesn't know I skip meals some weeks," he admits quietly, more to himself than to anyone listening. Doesn't need to know that part. The cabin is silent except for the low hum of the engines. You feel your throat tighten, and you're not the only one. You can see it in the faces around you. The sudden collective realization that the quiet old man everyone overlooked in seat 22A, then 34E, has been carrying an entire hidden weight of sacrifice that nobody bothered to notice until his body finally forced everyone to pay attention. The plane lands smoothly, paramedics boarding within minutes, and as they carefully move Amos onto a stretcher, something remarkable happens that none of you expected. Passengers begin to stand, not to disembark. The plane hasn't even reached the gate, but simply to stand in quiet respect as Amos is wheeled down the aisle, his veteran's cap now resting gently on his chest where the teenager placed it back for him. Dr. Bellamy walks beside the stretcher the entire way, refusing to let go of his role even after the emergency crew has taken over, and Ottilie follows close behind, still holding Amos's hand like she has no intention of letting go until someone who loves him is there to take her place. At the gate, paramedics confirm Amos is stable enough for immediate care, and as they wheel him toward a waiting ambulance, the airline staff, now fully aware of who this man is and what he sacrificed, begin making calls. Within the hour, someone tracks down Winifred's number from the emergency contact information in Amos's wallet, and she is on her way. Still weak from her own treatment, but moving faster than she has in months. Terrified of losing the father who never once let her see how much he was giving up for her. You don't leave the airport right away. None of the passengers who witnessed what happened do. You all find yourselves gathered near the gate, strangers an hour ago, now bound together by something that feels heavier and more meaningful than a delayed flight ever could. Dr. Bellamy stays to update the hospital staff. Ottilie sits quietly in a plastic terminal chair, still holding the small orange prescription bottle Amos had handed over, staring at it like it represents something she can't quite put into words. It's Ottilie who eventually breaks the silence, speaking not to anyone in particular but to the small crowd that's gathered. He gave up his seat without anyone asking twice, she says. Sat in the back of the plane. Skipped his own medication, sold his truck. Skips meals. Also, he could see his little girl. And not one of us thought to ask if he was all right before this happened. Nobody has an answer for that, because she's right, and everyone standing there knows it. 3 days later, you get an update through Dr. Bellamy, who exchanged information with the hospital before leaving. Amos is stable, recovering well. His medication regimen, finally fully covered thanks to a fund quietly started by the very passengers who sat beside him on that flight. The 2 teenagers, Ottilie, Dr. Bellamy, and dozens of strangers who felt compelled to do something after watching a man give everything without ever once asking for anything in return. But the story doesn't end with a hospital bed and a fundraiser. 2 weeks later, Amos is discharged, well enough to travel again, though this time his daughter Winifred insists on flying to see him instead, refusing to let her father make another exhausting cross-country trip while his heart is still healing. When she arrives at his small apartment, she finds something she never expected. A folder full of documents, quietly organized, detailing every flight he'd taken over the last 2 years, every skipped meal noted with a small tally mark, every stretched-out medication, refill dated meticulously in his careful handwriting. It wasn't self-pity. It was simply a record, kept the way a soldier keeps a log, methodical and honest, as if some part of him always knew someone might need to understand what it actually cost him one day. Winifred sits on the floor of her father's small living room and cries, in a way she hasn't allowed herself to since her diagnosis, not from sadness this time, but from an overwhelming, humbling gratitude for a man who never once let her carry the weight of his sacrifice, even as he carried the weight of hers. Word of what happened on that flight eventually reaches the airline's corporate office, and rather than treating it as a liability to manage, something unusual happens. The airline reaches out directly to Amos, offering him free flights for the rest of his life to see his daughter, along with a formal apology for how easily an elderly passenger was overlooked in a system built around efficiency rather than people. It's a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, but for Amos, who never asked for anything and never expected anything, it means he'll never again have to choose between his medication and his daughter's face. You keep in touch with Ottilie for a while after that day. The two of you bonded by something neither of you fully expected to experience on an ordinary domestic flight. She tells you once, months later over coffee, that she thinks about Amos often, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet awe. He taught me something up there, she says, not through anything he said, just through what he did without saying anything at all. You think about that a lot too, long after the memory of turbulence and emergency landings has faded into just another story you tell. You think about how easily Amos could have been left in seat 22A, unnoticed, uncomplaining, and how close the entire plane came to never knowing anything about the quiet sacrifice happening right in the middle of economy class. You think about how many other Amos Whitfields are out there right now, sitting in the back rows of planes in waiting rooms, in grocery store checkout lines, quietly giving up everything for someone they love without ever once expecting anyone to notice. Amos still flies to see Winifred every few months now, seated comfortably, medication fully stocked, no longer forced to calculate the cost of love against the price of survival. And every time he boards a plane, there's a chance, however small, that the person sitting beside him has no idea what quiet, extraordinary courage looks like until they take the time to actually see it. The people who give the most are often the ones who ask for nothing at all. So look closer, because you might be sitting right beside someone who needs to be seen.